I'd like to call this meeting of the Lakota Board of Education to order. Jenny, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Casper?
Here.
Mr. Lovell?
Here.
Mrs. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. Parnell?
Here.
Mrs. Schaefer?
Here. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Jenny, will you please, or discussion? Jenny, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Parnell?
Yes.
Mr. Lovell?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Connor?
Yes.
Mrs. Schaefer?
Yes. Now we'll start talking about high school transportation. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Mrs. Schaefer. One piece of information just to share with the board. At our last meeting, we talked about putting out a survey to our community in terms of busing and ridership. In front of you is the Google Doc that was sent electronically today. This is the latest version of a very simple but I think telling survey in terms of where the momentum is in terms of who would ride and who wouldn't ride. You can see it's pretty simple, pretty easy. We had over 4,800 responses. You can see where the numbers were in terms of where kids were at and what building, what grade bands, and then you could also see what the intended ridership would be at the high school. So almost 98% of the people that replied have students in the district. Ridership grade bands are listed below. And on the last page again is if you have one in high school or one going into high school, would you ride? And so I just think that that was something quick, easy for us to put out just to get some data on. So glad to take any questions on that piece or any comments.
Was there an effort made to get the survey filled out by people that might not have access to internet or?
We had some pockets of that we had some of our liaisons work with
Okay.
some of our families, but the numbers were pretty small,
Okay.
just because of the access that most of our community has. But
Okay.
yeah, important but not significant in terms of the end data.
I did have some comments back from some families whose children were attending private schools.
Yep.
And they actually had to respond as though their child was already in a Lakota school in order to fill out the survey, so
Yeah.
that
And,
might have been a little
yeah,
confusing
and
for
those
people.
numbers, again, not high, but yeah, we get it. Yep.
Right.
Anybody else on that?
No.
Chris, you want to?
For those who are watching, 86.2% of people responded that they would transport their freshmen, 87.2 for sophomores, 57.6 for juniors, and 33.9 for seniors, and 4.4 said that they would not use transportation.
I'll let Mr. Passarge handle the next piece on just different options.
Good evening. I wanted to go over the sheet that I have in front of you today. Some of it recovers some of the things we've talked about before, some of the options we talked about, and also from our last meeting, some things that people wanted to also be explored as well. But just to go over the sheet itself, I started out with the current operations just to make sure we all understand where we are today. Currently, we have 167 routes. That includes all transportation for students in grades K through 8 in both Lakota and non-Lakota schools that are eligible for transportation. With that, we currently have 1,246 students at 19 different K-8 non-Lakota schools. For bullet point number 5, that's non-Lakota schools. That's not clear on that. And bullet point number 6 is we transport 9,901 Lakota students to 18 different K-8 Lakota schools. So even though the number of students is less, we transport to actually more non-Lakota schools than Lakota schools for grades K through 8. Some of the, and for each scenario, I also put some information, some concerns or considerations that we would need to further discuss or maybe prompt more discussion going forward. The number one thing that you'll see no matter what we do going forward is the recruitment and retention of bus drivers. It's a statewide, nationwide issue, finding quality bus drivers and retaining quality bus drivers. So that's something that we need to consider moving forward. if there are any changes, that we have to keep that in mind, that it's difficult right now to get bus drivers for the 167 routes that we have. If we add more in the future, it's going to be, not that we say we can't, but it may be more difficult to get drivers to do all those routes as well. And another thing that we look at too, with the bell times we have right now and the support of the non-Lakota schools, we have all of our assets out between 2:30 and 4 p.m. So that makes it difficult for us to do field trips for people who want to do field trips and get back maybe after their bell time, like at 3:30 or 4, and parents pick them up after school for elementary kids. It makes it very difficult for shuttles for athletes going from the freshman building to main campus, or getting like our cross-country kids to different locations to practice. We struggle with that on a daily basis to get kids to different places between that, especially between the 3 and 4 p.m. hour. We don't have enough drivers. We have enough buses, but we don't have enough drivers right now to continuously do that. And that continues to be a struggle for us. So that's our current operation. Anybody have any questions about the current operation or things they would like to know that can maybe help provide?
Any other concerns or issues with what we're currently doing?
No, I think it's working right now. We continue to look at trying to be as efficient as possible. We still do have some exclusion zones for some schools, like Endeavor or Woodland. Kids that live right across the street or have good walking paths. We have exclusion zones for them as well. But for schools that have no around them, like Independence or Van Gordon, they don't have any exclusion zones because there's really no walkable homes close to that area.
Any other safety issues that you're seeing right now?
No other safety issues as far as transportation. So I'll move on to option 1. Option 1 is we're looking at providing freshman transportation only. So that would be to all of Lakota freshmen and all the freshmen that to attend eligible non-Lakota schools. And looking at that, we would assume there would be 34 routes for Lakota East and Lakota West freshmen that would be needed. Oops, that's not good. And there would be 15 routes for 7 non-Lakota schools for freshmen only.
Can you explain eligible non-Lakota schools? How do they determine that?
Eligibility is determined by the state. It has to be within a 30-minute drive of their home school on a school bus during normal hours. So if a student went to Moeller High School, let's give an example, and lived in the west attendance zone, they would have to live within 30 minutes on a bus drive from West to Moeller in order to qualify for that. And it's not a mile, it's not a radius, it's a drive time of 30 minutes or less. So if they live outside that 30 minutes, schools would not be eligible. We do have some that are further down towards Cincinnati that it takes more than 30 minutes to get there on a bus between 7 and 8 a.m. typically.
Sure.
So it's not necessarily all Lakota students or all Lakota families that are sending their kids to private school don't necessarily get transportation at the high school level if they're too far out. It's not an automatic thing. It has to be that 30
Well,
minutes.
yeah, but
Is there- and
it's
is there-
based on the school they would attend, so East and West both are within 30 minutes of most of the schools that we would provide
So
transportation.
there's probably not any exclusions to that. Okay.
Right, so it's not based on your residence. So if you
Right.
live on the northern part of the district, you may be more than 30 minutes from your home, but
But
from
it's
your
be from your home school.
home school of attendance, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So looking at the additional 34 routes for Lakota East and West students and the 15 routes for 15 routes for non-Lakota students, we would, the total number of routes would be 216 compared to the 167 we have right now. Estimated cost for Lakota freshmen will be $1.87 million, and for non-Lakota students would be $825,000 roughly per year, with a total of $2.6 million, almost $2.7 million for all freshmen that live in the community, regardless of what school they went to. Some of the concerns and considerations that you would need to consider if we went this route. There may be some buses, especially for non-Lakota buses, that you would have space on the bus for sure, but if we're only providing freshman transportation, that means sophomores, juniors, or seniors would not be eligible to ride, even though there would be transportation. So that would have to be a communication that would have to go out, and we have to go through explanation of why they can't ride, even though there is space. So that's one thing we'd have to consider. Again, recruitment and retention of drivers. And there may be some improvement if we have buses that are doing the freshman routes. When they get done, they may have enough time to just start doing some shuttles or some other things for some of the extracurricular activities. So there could be a benefit for some of the struggles we have right now between the 2 and 4 p.m. where those buses would finish up a freshman route, especially if they're in district, and have the availability to go pick up a team right after their route to take them to practice or do something like that. So that could be an improvement that we could see with freshmen only. And we'd have to look at, and no matter what we do, if we had buses in the future, we'd have to look at the service center. It's always going to be something we need to look at, the number of drivers and the number of buses. If we increase that, making sure we have enough space in our lots to accommodate the parking for the drivers, which if you've ever been to the service center, it overflows
Into-
Liberty Junior with all the parking, and just enough spaces for the buses. We have, in the past, had about 230-something buses on the lot before, so it's doable, but it gets really tight.
Is there room for expansion should you need to?
There is room for expansion, and we are looking at those options as well. Even right now, with our current situation, we are looking, because our maintenance department shares that as well. So between our maintenance department, and they have all their vehicles, the plows and stuff
Child
we have to
nutrition.
store. Child nutrition is back there as well. They have a couple vehicles. So between Lakota support vehicles and buses, there's a lot of activity that goes on behind the service center, and we're looking to expand that.
Chris, I may be missing it, but how many buses do we currently have?
Currently we have 167 current routes, and we have 184 total.
That's what I was wondering was
Yeah,
the total.
184 total, right around there.
Chris, I notice on the roads that there are a lot more white vans. Are those vans unable to transport to private schools if there are significantly less number of kids that are going there? Would that be a decreased cost, or does it have to be a full-size yellow bus to make that route?
Vans are eligible to transport special needs or special ed kids, homeless kids, and foster care kids.
Okay.
So you're only eligible to transport those. You can't transport regular education students in the white vans.
And that's a state law?
Yes. So that might be something to look at.
It's an interesting,
Yes.
can transport all these kids, but not, right,
Right.
okay.
In a previous conversation, I had mentioned that Butler Tech was doing something different this year, kind of an, excuse me, an educational Uber. Have we had any conversation? I'd ask that we look into that to see what they were doing and if that was possibly something we might think about modeling as well.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Pretty much what I just said. It's an educational Uber, and they obviously don't provide busing for all of their students,
Right.
but they do have some circumstances where they need transportation.
I have a meeting coming up with John Graff, I'll ask him.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And just to be clear, for the white vans, those are vans that we've increased our van service or bring that more in-house where Peterman does that service instead of going through UTS or another service provider. And it saves us about $500,000 a year if we bring it in-house. So that's why we did that.
Yeah.
The savings for that is better for the cost, and our service has been drastically improved. If you talk to any of our special ed teachers or people who have to deal with the vans, because we control them now, we're not on the mercy of the group and when they can be there. So
Okay.
that's been a good
Now,
help
can
for
they be
us.
used to transport athletes after school, or is
Yes,
it?
they can be used for extracurricular trips and things like that for small teams. And we do use some of the vans for those activities instead of a yellow school bus. It just can't be used for regular transportation.
Okay.
So, any questions about option number 1, freshman-only transportation?
I'm, not specifically just about that, but, I mean, when there's conversation that's being had around recruitment and retention of drivers, et cetera, we use a third party to transport through Peterman, right? I'm assuming that if they sign the contract, they're making the statement that they're signing it because they believe that they can staff it and maintain it, right?
Correct, correct.
Okay. I mean, I just have a hard time wrestling with that one when they could just as right say, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to fulfill this, so we're not signing the contract. So I don't feel like that should be a worry necessarily on our end. Is that,
I think the problem, from what I understand, is not them hiring them, it's them quitting. There's a ton of turnover
Okay.
halfway through, and I don't know how that affects, if
This-
that affects, I
Yeah,
don't know.
when we started the year, we had 19 sub-drivers, and between illnesses, accidents, life happens type of things, pretty much all of them now are on regular routes. So the big sub pool we had to start the year, all of them are doing regular routes, so that leaves very limited options if we have a driver get sick or something else happens to them throughout the
Sure.
year.
Yeah.
So, and that's where we're struggling. We're getting people in to do regular routes, and we're okay with that, but trying to keep them healthy and going and not needing, in the use of subs. I know Peterman offers, and this is on their own, this is not something that we do. They offer incentives for, if you get a referral, they pay for your training, they give a bonus if you stay for a certain amount of time. So they're trying to do things in their power to make sure they can recruit and retain drivers, so. And every one of my peers at other districts are having similar problems recruiting and retaining drivers. So it's not a Lakota or Peterman issue, it's a statewide issue. If you talk to anybody at state ODE, people with transportation,
sure.
they'll say it's a problem statewide. All right,
So before
Okay,
we move
yeah,
on,
sure.
I just wanted to mention too, so when we talk about transportation, there's two sides of that coin. So we do receive some revenue from the state, and then we have expenditures. So on the revenue side, if we would think about doing transportation during this biennium, there's no additional monies from the state because we're basically getting what we got last year, no additional monies. But if we fast forward to the next biennium and assume that some sort of funding mechanism would be back in place, I took the funding mechanism that was in place prior to this biennium and assumed 1,200 students for freshmen. If we had 1,200 additional riders for freshmen, that would lead to approximately $440,000 more coming from the state. So as we analyze this in the future, that is part of this analysis. But again, during this biennium,
It's 2021,
correct, so it
End of
doesn't,
that fiscal year.
doesn't
Two more
make
school
any
years.
Into these numbers here?
they are not.
no, it is
Not a
This is-
not,
This is
it's a
straight
guess.
expense,
It's
Correct.
just, yeah, it's not a real number.
yeah.
and that
But-
depends if something gets approved in the next biennium for it as
Yeah,
well.
right now.
That's
we-
assuming that,
Right now, it's zero.
But hasn't there been a lot of conversation about changing the funding formula for transportation and
There's
push
been
across the state to make sure that that happens?
a lot of conversation, and I will say that doing more for transportation is definitely something that you hear from a
Yes.
lot of the school districts in southeast Ohio. And our Speaker of the House is from southeast Ohio. So I'm saying that because I know it comes up in our conversations quite a bit as we talk about state funding, so.
It
I'm
feels
just
like
throwing that
something's
out.
going to happen in that regard.
Yeah, so.
Option 2?
So option 2, I looked at providing transportation to all grades 9 through 12, and assumed there would be no bell changes. So basically, just adding high school transportation for grades 9 through 12 with no changes to any of our bell systems. So that what that really means is we'd have buses doing one-tier routes. Currently, our buses do 3-tier routes. That's the most efficient, so you have one asset doing 3 different things. So they'll come in and do a junior high route, they'll come in and do an elementary route, then they'll come back and do an ECS route. Most of our buses, most of our routes do 3 tiers. In this option, there wouldn't be that option to do 3 tiers. There could be an option to maybe do 2, But for purposes of this, we looked at them only being able to do one tier. And that's where the cost came from for this, just so we're clear. So if we looked at adding 912 without any changes to bell times, it would be 68 routes for Lakota East and Lakota West, 9 through 12, and we'd retain the 15 routes for the 7 non-Lakota schools that would be eligible. So it'd be 250 routes compared to the 167 we currently have. The estimated cost is about $3.7 million for the Lakota students and the same $825,000 for non-Lakota, with a total cost of $4.5 million. That's assuming we left everything the same. Again, recruitment and retention of drivers. We have a lot of single-tier routes, which are not efficient, which means we have a lot of extra assets, buses to maintain, but they're only doing one thing. It does not alleviate the struggle for the field trips and the shuttles. Since they will be transporting high school kids at that time, they can't get back and really do a shuttle unless we move practices back 35, 45 minutes. Then they come back and do a shuttle after they do their route. Again, we look at the changes at the service center, and we'd also assume there would be no zero bill transportation for zero bill at the high school. That'd still be a requirement for parents to provide zero bill transportation if they choose that as an option. It's something we may be able to look at if we ever go this route, but I assume that there would be no zero bill in this analysis.
I have a question, just in general. How is the Peterman contract structured? Who owns the buses?
As we go through and as buses age out, they are owned by the district. When they age out, Peterman purchases that asset and become Peterman assets. So
And do they lease them back to us?
they don't lease them, they amortize that cost, they're able to amortize that cost over the contract of or life of that bus. And as they add new buses into the system, there's a slight increase for newer buses compared to ones that have been in the system.
We pay more per mile, correct, in the contract for when we're using their assets
Correct.
versus ours?
It's we're on an hourly rate, so the hourly rate's a little bit higher for buses that are owned by Peterman compared to buses that are owned by the district.
Okay. So we still own a lot of buses.
No, we own very few buses now. We own probably less than 50 buses now, and we're getting close to our last buses being done. So if we wanted to go back and buy our buses, that would have to come out of our PI fund or some other fund, and buses run between $90,000 and $100,000 a bus. So we could buy our own buses and Peterman can operate them, but that would be money out of the PI. We would have to do that, or general fund, of course.
And if we did something different than our current contract now, it's just an addendum.
Yeah, if we decided to buy our own buses, we'd have a different hourly rate than what we pay right now.
I just mean in general, anything additional, high
Correct.
school, right?
Correct.
And
Like,
it
for
doesn't-
example, one of the things that is being talked about is more money coming from the state to purchase buses. So if
Right.
something like that changes and we want to build that into our plans moving forward, then that could be
Yeah,
part of it.
if we get money from the state to buy them, we would buy them, and
Right.
so
Well, does the
those-
cost of a bus amortized over its useful life make up for the difference in the per mile cost? Do we know that?
I do not know that offhand.
It's
But
been a
we-
while since
Because
we
we have to
looked
pay
at that.
cash for it. We got to pay for the entire asset up front with cash. We can't amortize it over.
We could go back and look at it, Todd. It's been a while since we looked at that analysis,
Right.
but we can go back.
What's the date of expiration on that contract?
We have 4 years left
I was
on
going
it.
to say 4 more years.
And it doesn't extend the contract or start over or anything like that,
No.
right?
Did we bid that out, or
Yes.
You did.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
did.
Any questions about option number 2? Option number 3 looked at basically 912 transportation again, but looking at altering some bell times for the high school so we could get the buses to do a freshman route to come back and do a high school route. We basically need about 50 minutes in between bell times for our transportation to pick up, drop, then head back out, pick up and drop. So When we looked at it, we assumed that the main campus bell time would change from 8:05. The current one is 8:05 to 2:40, and we would change it from 8:40 to 3:15. This would allow for most of the routes to be double tiered in lieu of single tier. Assumes we need 36 routes for east and west and 15 again for the non-Lakota. So instead of the 250 routes for 9 through 12 as is, we would need 218 buses. So you would save some in that area, but you'd have to alter that main campus bell time, which, when I go down to the possible concerns and considerations, we can talk about that. But estimated cost is $2.6 million for Lakota students and $825,000 for non-Lakota for $3.4 million in lieu of the $4.5 million. So you save about roughly over $1 million by changing the bell time.
Would this be the bell time for 1 through 6, and then 0 period would be prior to this, in your assumptions here?
Correct, correct. But there may be a way to look at, because in the morning there is such a big gap because the freshman building starts at 7:15. And if we didn't start till 8:40 for first period, there may be something we could look at for 0 bell in this option because there's such a large gap in between those bell times. And that would be a tune of, if you have a 0 period, you get picked up by the freshman bus. Freshmen get dropped off, and they shuttle you over to the main campus, drop you off, then go start their high school route. That could be an option for the 0 period kids. But I didn't assume that in this scenario.
Okay, so these options are possibly short-term options, because we haven't factored in any facilities planning into these, correct?
Correct. This is just as is, basically.
The last one.
Coming up
was,
on the back.
Oh, never mind.
5.
So some of the things that we want to talk about with the change in the main campus bell time only, it still does not alleviate the struggle for the 2:30 to 4 o'clock assets. We'd have even more assets out at between that time with the release of the high school at 3:15. The sharing of staff between the freshman and main campus may be more difficult due to the larger gap in bell times. They may not sync up right now. It doesn't mean we can't, but right now we have a pretty good plan about kids at the freshman building that need to go up to main campus to take courses. So we have that worked out right now. We'd have to work through those. And also talking with Keith about the Cyber Academy and computer science classes. You know, those instructors now, we have their day set up where they could do different things. It might be more difficult to do that. So we might be able to figure it out. It's just saying we may have to look at staffing if we need to hire or do something different with staffing to offer some courses at both freshman and main campus. 0 bell would overlap 2 full bells at the freshman and make it more difficult. Impact of starting school activities later. Impact varies. Some activities may like it or be better. Some may be impacted. You know, most kids will practice later into the evening now or have practices that go later if they start an hour later. It could be good or bad. I didn't make it that determination. It's just something to consider. And for after-school activities, those freshmen that do come to the main campus doesn't get out till 3:15 in this model, so they would have to sit around for about 50 minutes waiting for the upperclassmen to get out. So what would you do during that 50 minutes for the freshmen for supervision and things of that nature while they're waiting for their activities to start at the main campus? So that is option number 3 with the change in the high school main campus bell time. Any questions about that option? Okay, option number 4 looks at the district as a whole and changing the bell times for a variety of schools to try to be more efficient and have everybody on the 3-tier system. So what we look at is something that it was similar to what we had before 2011 when we provided transportation to all schools. We'd have the 3 different tiers and we'd break up the schools in those tiers. It'd be slightly different because the high schools were always earliest. And I guess there's been studies that say high schools should start later, so we've tried to accommodate that. So in this scenario, in Tier 1, which would be the early start schools, so 7:25 for the junior schools and 7:15 for the freshmen, try to maintain the current bell times. So the bell times would be basically where they are right now. So that would be your Tier 1 schools would be those. And mixed in would be any of the non-Lakota schools, of course, based on their bell times. Tier 2 would have the high school main campus go at their regular time. And then also in Tier 2 would have Adena, Endeavor, Union, and Van Gordon all be in that middle tier from an 8:20 to a 3:10 start. So all those schools would be on that Tier 2 route, which is a little bit different now because all of our elementaries are on the Tier 2. All the 3-6 are on the Tier 2, and all the ECSs are on the Tier 3. For Tier 3, would have all 6 ECS buildings, plus Cherokee, Freedom, Independence, and Woodland would go from 9:10 to 4 p.m. This allows for triple tier routing, which is the most efficient. It assumes between 215 and 220 routes. That's $3.5 to $3.8 million for all. And the buildings were selected. It wasn't a random act where, you know, I know that the buildings like to be, especially elementaries, like to be in that earlier tier, but it's based on the routing that we did. We actually did some routing. What it'll look like was those buildings would drop off and be in close proximity to their next route. So if you look at the ones there, for the most part, they're in close proximity to other schools where they could do other things relatively easy, cover other areas. So that's why they were chosen for the middle and the late tiers. Some of the challenges, some things we need to consider, sharing of special and innovation teachers amongst the buildings. We have a system right now that shares those teachers across those buildings. Not to say we couldn't do it, something we just have to look at in more detail on who provides what service to what building. Coordinating PD, professional development for those groups. Right now, they're in clusters. You know, the elementary groups can go together because they're on the same bell time and can do different things. If they're not at the same bell time, they'd have more difficulty doing things during the normal work week. Another thing I looked at is right now all the elementary schools get home before the ECS schools. So you may have maybe a sixth grader or fifth grader sibling that could be home to help get the younger sibling off the bus. For some families, that might be something that they rely on. But at Cherokee, Freedom, Indian, Woodland, they may get home at different times or at the same time. There's no guarantee that elementary student would be home before their ECS student. So that could be something that we could consider or could be an issue for some families. It's things that came about during our discussions. So those are that's the options for 9/12 for everybody with multiple changes in bell times.
I think the other thing that we need to be aware of too, that's a pretty big burden on families to have a 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th grader being done with school at 2:25. That's a long time before the end of a workday as well. And when you start looking at current schedules, I think it's a little bit easier when you have a junior high kid or a freshman, or junior high kid, not freshman, but to have an elementary kid, it's a burden.
Well, the elementary gets home at 3:10 still.
Yeah,
What's
it
that?
would be 3:10 would be the earliest according to this.
The Cherokee, Freedom, Indian, Woodland, am I reading that wrong?
Cherokee, they'll get home at 4.
They'd get home at 4.
What's the 7:25?
That's early childhood.
Oh, the early child, okay.
Actually, they wouldn't
Well,
get
here,
home
no.
at 4.
They-
They get out of school at 4.
It is Smith.
So it's all
It's
early
missed.
childhood,
Okay.
and all those elementaries would be the 9:20
I
to
read
4
that wrong.
p.m.
Yeah, they dismiss at 4 p.m. So they get home between 4 and 5 typically.
Chris, you referenced the research before about older kids getting up later. In this case, we've got the youngest kids getting up the latest. Did you think about anywhere where that could be flipped?
We looked at that, but then if you get ECS getting home at 2:25, I think that proposes some issues too with
Childcare,
childcare.
older
So
kids being home first to take care of the.
we could look at that. It could be an option. Anything about option number 4? And the last option, we threw in there looking at transportation by moving the freshman students to the main campus and what that would look like. It's really hard to tell how that would look. So this is our best guess of what we think we would need. We would think we would need 52 routes for east and west, and still the same 15 routes for non-Lakota schools. So it's about $3.8 million for Lakota and $825,000 for non-Lakota, $4.6 million. That's assuming that it's a one-tier system. Again, there could be opportunities to move that down into a first tier or a second tier and look at that, but we really didn't have the routing software couldn't figure that out for us in a timely fashion. We'd have to start from scratch, and that would take a couple weeks to do that. So we did our best analysis about what we think for the number of buses it would be. So there could be some improvement on that number, but that's what we think it would be right now by just moving the freshmen up. And that has a whole different conversation about
I was
the
going to say, that's
academics.
not even an option if we did that, it's so far down the road, correct?
Correct.
It's
Yeah.
pretty far down the road.
And I'm struggling with how this option is slightly more expensive than option 2, because it says that option 2 is adding 68 routes for Lakota kids, and this would be adding 52 for Lakota kids.
It's all, the single tier routes are just, they're not as efficient. They can only do that one route. So,
They're
But
more
wouldn't it still
expensive.
be more routes are going to be more expensive?
not necessarily,
Okay.
because for the one above it, you're talking about for the option number 4,
5 compared to 2.
5 compared to 2.
So I would think, because both of them say they're all single-tier routes, they're both transporting all the kids. It seems like if all the kids were in the same building, there's got to be some efficiencies that are gained there. And according to this modeling, well, we're only having to do 52 versus 68 routes, it actually costs more. So I'm just
I may have to
having
look
a
at
hard
that.
time following that one. But again, like we said, that would be so far down the road and
Right.
a lot of variables.
I'll look at
between
that one
now and
again. I might have had a cut and paste error on that one.
But I think that option 5 is a great data point for the facilities committee as we're having conversations around what might a plan look like in the future, and being able to take that into consideration.
then. Right.
I think definitely something to think about. I think too, I don't want to get away from option 5, but again, down the road, but when I look at some of these, there's positives and negatives each one. I guess my concerns would be in option 3. I get a little bit, I have a little angst about potentially limiting educational opportunities for kids.
I agree, I don't like option
So,
3 at all, for that reason.
that one, I mean, there's a lot of implications in that. And again, just initial thoughts. And then just on option 4 about the wide swing on start times and end times for some of the kids. And I totally understand and the research on starting later for high school, but I'm not so sure we want to put some younger kids start times at 7:25 also. So a lot of moving
I think
pieces.
too that when we talk about, I think we did move that to what is considered a later start time for the high school.
Right.
I mean, a lot of, that is pretty much the norm in our area now. Mason just moved theirs to a little bit, I think 7:50 for next year. They were very early for high school. Yeah, I don't love 3 at all because I don't want to give up any educational opportunities. And the moving of the back and forth of the start times, we just did that. We just moved everybody to the same tier. And if there's any discussion in the next couple of years of combining buildings or whatever the facilities plan, I know we have nothing on the books as of now. There is no plan. But then we'd probably have to change the times again. And it just seems like a lot of back and forth of changing of the times of the school to accommodate, like I said, to accommodate the families who have kids that come home, the younger ones, the older one to be home. Yeah, I don't like 3 at all.
Chris, I just had one question too, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I just want to go back to a point you made earlier. You mentioned the service building parking areas and how that would be a concern. But I think I heard you say, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, that that's already something that you and your team are looking at now.
Correct.
Based on your current configuration.
Correct.
So that's not like because of adding something, we have to add more. You'd have to add more anyway.
We're planning on adding more,
Pretty close.
but we got to add you know, we have one footprint that we're looking at now to accommodate. Do we need to make that footprint a little bit bigger?
Okay.
I think in our planning process, we will, whatever we do, we'll make sure it's expandable.
Yeah.
So whatever we come up with, we don't want to design it for a specific size and go, okay, 2 more years down the road, 3 more years down the road, we're going to need more room and be locked in, or not have something that's flexible enough to allow us to grow.
Is there, when you're talking about expanding the bus lot, is there conversations around moving part of the fleet to a different part of the township as well? It just seems to me in my mind that if you're having conversations logistically, if you've got buses servicing the west side of the district versus the east side, would there be cost savings in routes that way?
Yeah, we looked at that in 2010. We did an analysis with a group called Transpart. It came in and looked at all of our routing for efficiency. And we did look at things like that, but it became a sort of a management issue and
Okay.
dual resource issue where you have to have multiple fuel tanks, buses would drive longer to get fuel, management issues, security, maintenance,
Soft costs would kill
soft
you.
costs, that type of thing. So they looked at that, and it didn't provide any benefit to do that.
Chris, is part of your plan on the service center, is that part of the master's facility plan, or is that a separate entity?
It's separate, it's not, we haven't looked at any support buildings as part of our master facilities plan yet. At some point, I think we should and
Right.
would, but right now, we're just looking at daily
So
operations
in your
right
committee,
now.
it's just the actual school?
We're just looking at school buildings right now
Right,
to house
okay.
kids, but at some point, we'll need to look at support buildings as well.
Mm.
Other questions for Chris?
Chris, remind us again of the lead time, that if we're adding busing any busing next year, how much time you need?
8 to 10 months.
So January to August is 8 months. Okay, so,
I know the transportation department said they'd like to know sooner rather than later,
right, I'm
but
sure, yeah.
that's just for their planning purposes, you know, because,
Well, I mean, when you're talking recruitment and
Right.
retention.
and part of it is getting the assets too. They would have to make sure they get their bus orders in. Usually they get them in by January to make sure they're here by August. So if they order them anytime after January, you may not have enough buses in the fleet to service the additional routes. They could get some from other, because Durham's a large organization. They could get used buses from a bunch of other places if they needed to support it until they get the other ones in, but it would be a logistical piece we'd have to work through, you know, in and out buses. We already have enough struggles with the number of spaces we have now.
So Jenny, you're going to be preparing scenarios for these options for the 5-year forecast meeting November 18th?
I am planning on doing that, but my question to all of you is, we've got 5 scenarios. Do you want me to look at all 5? Or do you want me to narrow it down to, I'm just throwing this out, freshman transportation only and 9-12 transportation with no bell changes?
Yeah, I think you're looking at option 1 and 2
That's
right now.
what I'm
based
hearing.
on
I
what other
agree.
people have said, and
Yeah.
that's fine.
I agree, 3
Now,
is,
when you factor that in the second year of the 5-year forecast, you'll take into consideration the additional revenue
Correct,
from the state and all that.
yes. I will assume additional revenue coming back in once this biennium is over.
And remind us, in our last contract negotiations, we saved $2.2 million in that contract from what we'd previously been paying for transportation.
Correct.
And
So
we
I-
have not,
I-
2.2 million over how long?
A year is
A
my
year.
understanding.
That was
Per
it.
year?
per
Yeah.
year.
per year over the life.
And we have not reallocated that 2.2 million.
We have not sat down and said, this savings, how do we want to spend that additional savings? No, that
Okay.
has not been part of our conversation.
So we're talking 400,000, and then you're talking about in the next budget, we could possibly be saving 4,000.
440.
400,000. So it could ultimately be a wash based on what we saved on our contract and what the new funding model might give us for 9th grade busing only.
It is possible.
I think we're counting our chickens before they're hatched when we look at the biennium budget a year and a half away.
I also agree, but I believe that when we're doing assumptions, we have to assume what happens after this biennium and I'm just gonna go on the record as saying, doing nothing with transportation in a second biennium, I think that that is not probable. Some type of transportation funding will be back. You can write that down, and I could be wrong, but
I don't think so.
that's
I
my
mean-
prediction.
I mean, you work closely with that, so you
Agree
would
with
be.
you.
And I think that's the assumption that we should use for the 5-year forecast.
I hope you're right.
I hope I am too.
I would be interested in seeing some bell change possibilities and what that looks like. I think we also need to, as we look at the scenarios, 3 and 4 also called for possibly additional staff, and that needs to be figured into the scenario as well. If we're not able to share staff because the bell changes happen, then that needs to be considered.
But I don't think we're looking at
We're not looking at
options.
4. We're not looking
3
at
or
option
4.
4.
So what I had asked for was I would like to see a scenario spelled out with bell changes.
Which one?
3 or 4.
I would go with 3.
Okay.
Can you tell me more about that, just so I understand, so I make sure we're covering it the right
I
way?
just want to make sure that we're fully looking at all of the options that are in front of us. I feel like we're throwing up roadblocks to some of the options, like it might be an inconvenience, and that may absolutely be true, but we're assuming something without really looking at it as fully as we could. So I would like to see it laid out in the 5-year forecast. I also think, although I don't know that we can model that at this point, there will be efficiencies in number 5 in combining campuses and reducing operating costs from 4 campuses to 2.
Right.
And Jenny, I don't know if you can do anything with that, but I would certainly like to understand that better if that's an option.
Yeah,
Whether it's a long-term option that we're thinking about, the rest of this is going to be an intermediate step, or maybe we move that up to being more of a priority based on what the costs look like.
Yeah, I think option 5, as we go further with our facilities planning, we'll know more and be able to forecast, but I don't think we'll have enough knowns to be able to do a very good scenario for option 5
Since
for
we're
next month.
I mean,
So
from a-
far,
From a facilities committee perspective, I mean, we've just looked at the 12 options.
we don't even
like it's not
have
even-
any kind of facilities plan
There's-
whatsoever.
So as that information
None.
becomes available, I would be interested in it.
Can we go back to option 3, though? I've got the information as far as the routes, but when we start talking about staffing and the changes in staffing,
Right, how are we
I
gonna?
really don't know where to go with that.
And I think that's going to be more conversations with the high school and the sharing of the freshman and main campus. The Zero Bell is going to drive that, and the Cyber Academy and
Right.
those specialty courses, how those can still be offered and managed with our current staffing. If there's a way to do it with a big separation of bell times, just at first glance, we're like, ooh, doesn't look good.
Right.
But sit down and maybe be more creative about it, we might be able to. We just don't know. We just put that as something we need to consider
Right.
going
Yeah,
forward.
and then the whole 50 minutes for the freshmen to sit in the main campus in Wade really disturbs me as well on that option. I mean,
I'm sure it probably disturbed the high school
I'm
administrators.
sure it does. I'm sure it disturbs the high school administration as well, as they have freshmen just wandering the building for 50 minutes.
All right, so is providing transportation at the high school level something that the board is still interested in continuing to pursue?
Yes, for me.
Yeah, I mean, I said it last meeting, I'm good with the information we have. I personally think that the freshman transportation-only option is the most desirable at this point. I'm not all for changing academic schedules around and programming and anything like that to look at the 10-12, because we know, I mean, based on the survey, obviously there's desire for 10th grade, but 11th and 12th, it drops off significantly. Plus, we also know from past history that the buses are pretty empty when you look at 10 to 12.
Right.
The desire is there, but doesn't always come to reality. And so, for me, I'm ready whenever.
I think, too, then we need to look at making some sort of commitment to make this decision soon, because we can't throw this on Chris's desk at,
I think, We have to approve the 5-year forecast on the 18th of November.
Excuse me.
I think we should plan on doing this at the
I
same
agree.
time.
We can't keep dragging our feet.
And
Yeah, I
that
mean,
gives us,
I-
that gives us
some time to get
That
9
would
months.
be good timing for.
Yeah, but I don't think there's anything gonna be on the 5-year forecast that's going to shock anybody from option 1 or 2. I mean, we've heard the numbers, we know what we saved, we know what the reality might be, or we have an idea of what the reality might be in 2 years. So, I mean, I feel like it's this constant, let's just kick the can down a little bit further and keep having conversation about it. And again, I've not been shy in the last 3 years that I've been able to have a voice on this board about my desire to look at busing for our 9th graders. It's needed, it's obviously desired,
Obviously.
and we have the money to do it. And so I submit to the will of the board at the point of when the rest of us are ready to make a decision on that. But that's how I feel.
I mean, I'd like to see the forecast, the models, but I kind of agree with Brad. I think we're leaning towards option 1.
Option
but I
one.
think we should
That's where I'm
ready
leaning.
to act on that on the November 18th meeting.
Well, I will prepare the scenarios and get them to you prior to the board meeting, so you will have some time, and that way, if you have questions, you
Sure.
can ask me, and that way you'll be ready with the information and the data to make a decision.
Works for me.
Great.
Other thoughts? Linda, you didn't weigh in?
I'm looking forward to seeing the long-term impact on our budget and what that looks like and Jenny's information. I do think it's an issue for us that we need to address, so look forward to seeing the information.
I'd also like to, we've discussed again another long-term piece that we've been told there's not the will in Columbus to charge a nominal fee for potentially some of our older grades, so that we don't run into a situation where if we did expand beyond 9th grade, that we have buses that are not fully utilized because people signed up for the service but then didn't utilize it. And if we charged a nominal fee, then people would only sign up to use the service if they actually had a need. And I think our buses would be more effectively utilized. And I know we've been told there isn't the educational will, or the political will to do that in Columbus. But I don't know if we've made a full court press on that effort to say this could actually expand the number of students who are receiving busing and how we might be able to do that. If
Or to
that might
be
be
able to
have
use
made
the
a full
van
court
service.
press.
What?
It seems like a no-brainer, too.
Right.
Well, we have made a full court press, and we did it 5 years ago, and we've had conversations with locally elected officials since then, and our issues are not the issues across the state, and that's what you're dealing with when you deal with changes in Columbus. And I do periodically bring it up, and the answer has not changed over the past 5 years. So, and I don't think OSBA is willing to pick that up as an issue either, nor is BASA or OASBO. And without the support of those 3 organizations doing a full court press, I don't think that will go anywhere.
Last year, we went to a class, and the transportation guy from OSBA said it's just, you'd have to charge a lot more than you think.
Well, I'm
And he
saying
said
a
it- he
split
said it
cost,
couldn't
yeah,
be
I'm not talking about charging the full amount.
Nominal. Yeah, I don't know why they're so,
Subsidize the cost of it.
I don't know why they're so against it.
And I remember we did get a legal opinion on it, but it's probably going back maybe even more than 5 years when we got a legal opinion on it. But, yeah, it's just kind of a non-starter anytime I have a conversation with anybody about it, but,
We didn't drop it lightly 5 years ago, but
It was probably Pete Chapisky last.
It was
I mean,
Pete.
he's the,
Yeah, it was Pete
Right.
that
He's the
spoke to
guy.
us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
okay.
They just don't seem to be too motivated.
our issue is not theirs, was actually how it was put.
Do we have data? I mean, it's not really going to inform much of this, but I'm just more curious, how many school districts in the state don't bus high school? Do we have any idea?
I bet we can find.
It'd be
that
an
out.
interesting fact just to find out what percentage, where do we lie? Suburban versus, break it down.
Right.
And again, I know we hear anecdotally from real estate folks that that does impact people who are, become aware of it before they buy their home, as to the desirability to
Absolutely.
purchase homes in Lakota, and how that impacts kind of the greater picture. All right. Any other questions or any other data, so that when we come to the 5-year forecast, we will have all information, nothing else that anyone says, we still need this information so that we can make an informed decision
We're gonna have the information before that meeting to
on the 5-year
decide on
forecast?
which one we're gonna
Vote on.
vote on, and then that will be tied to the 5-year forecast that we'll be voting on the same night, right?
Yeah, well, we'll just have to decide that night which model, because we won't be able to
Well, I
provide
thought we
it.
were gonna decide ahead of time.
She's going to give us the
We'll have the
information ahead of time.
information ahead.
We
Yeah.
can't decide until we're all together.
Yeah, I'll send you all the scenarios.
And that's our next meeting, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes,
only
in
have one.
in November, we only have one meeting, so it is the 18th
I believe it's the 18th.
of November,
It is.
so. All right. Anything else? All right, hearing nothing, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll move.
I'll second.
Jenny, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Connor?
Yes.
Mr. Lovell?
Yes.
Mr. Parnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Schaefer?
Yes.